Have you ever wondered, after the deepest wounds, can we ever truly believe in love again? Alexander Drake, a successful yet solitary CEO, had locked his heart away for years, building walls too high for anyone to climb. That is, until he met Olivia, a single mother carrying invisible scars too painful to name. It was in a moment so small it could have gone unnoticed that Alexander realized some wounds can only be healed by kindness and patience. So, what is it that makes someone, long frozen in their own silence, dare to open their heart once more? Let the story begin. Alexander Drake sat silently by the tall window, the pale gold light of late afternoon stretching long across the cold wooden floor. Below him, the city churned and buzzed like an endless symphony. Yet, up here, at the topmost floor encased in glass and steel, he felt as though he were lost in a desert where no voice could reach him. The charcoal gray suit clung perfectly to his tall frame, tailored as if the fabric itself had been woven for him. But the polished elegance couldn't mask the slow, smoldering sorrow in his eyes. Alexander could no longer recall the last time he had truly laughed. The lavish parties, the glittering handshakes, the multi-million-dollar deals. They were little more than a dusting of powder over a life hollowed out from within. Outside, the early winter wind howled, dragging heavy gray clouds across a dimming sky. The city lights flickered on, one by one. Tiny fires scattered against the dark, distant and cold. Alexander's gaze wandered to the horizon, where twilight had already begun to seep in, and a quiet heaviness settled over him, as if the weight of the entire sky rested on his shoulders. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. Alexander didn't turn. His assistant entered, holding a slim tablet, his voice careful, almost reverent, as if afraid to shatter the heavy air. "Mr. Drake," he said, "the interviews for the project assistant position are scheduled to start in 30 minutes. Would you like to review the candidates' files beforehand?" Alexander gave a small nod without shifting his gaze. "Leave it on the desk," he murmured, his voice low, barely more than a breath. The assistant placed the tablet neatly on the desk and withdrew, closing the door with a muted click. Alexander loosened the tight fist he hadn't realized he'd been clenching in his pocket. In the reflection of the glass, his own eyes met the glittering city lights, so near, yet as unreachable as stars scattered across a frozen sky. He stepped closer and pressed his palm lightly against the cool pane. A faint handprint bloomed where warmth touched ice, a fragile, fleeting imprint. In that moment, he was no longer the aloof CEO the world admired. He was just a man, lonely, unmoored, suspended in the empty air of his own life, yearning for something he could no longer name. Memories from lost years surged up like an undertow. Nights spent alone in a hollow apartment, the harsh neon slicing. Across dark windows, the clink of glasses at parties where he had always felt like an outsider looking in. He closed his eyes, let out a slow, resigned breath. Perhaps today would be just another long, colorless day. Or perhaps, though he no longer allowed himself the folly of hope, something unexpected awaited him. But expectation was a cruel teacher. He had learned that lesson too well. Alexander dropped his hand from the glass and turned toward the desk, moving neither hurriedly nor slowly, like an old clock, steady and unspeaking, marking the passage of time with patient inevitability. The tablet's screen glowed in the dim room. Candidate profile, Olivia Carter. Project assistant position. He skimmed the name. A stranger. A blurred photo of a woman appeared alongside it. A faint smile, eyes vast and shadowed, as if holding a secret sky of sorrow. Alexander picked up the tablet and stared at the photo for a long moment. There was no particular reason. Only that, something in those fragile, searching eyes unsettled the stillness inside him. He set the tablet back down, folded his arms, and turned once more to the vast, glittering city beyond the glass. The city lived and breathed below him. But his own heart, could it still remember how? He didn't know. Some people, even at the highest peaks, see only the empty sky stretching endlessly around them. Alexander's sigh dissolved into the heavy afternoon air, a threadbare whisper vanishing into the weary sky. Below the towering glass monoliths, the city churned on, bright, oblivious, relentless. Not far from the city's heart, Olivia Carter was weaving her way through the dense crowds, tugging two small children along behind her. An oversized, worn coat flapped around her slender frame, and a thin, gray scarf wound loosely around her neck. Her battered shoes slapped the pavement, in brisk, practiced strides, the hurried pace of someone who had long learned to race against time. "Come on, sweetheart," Olivia urged gently, though strain laced her voice. Emma, her elder child of about 8, clutched her little brother Noah's hand as they hurried alongside their mother. The children's cheeks were flushed from the winter air, but their eyes shone with a trust so pure it pierced Olivia's heart. She glanced at her watch. Less than 30 minutes until the interview. A knot of anxiety twisted in her gut, but her feet kept moving, steady and unyielding, as if fear itself had long since become an old companion. They turned into a narrow alley leading to the back gate of the elementary school. Olivia knelt, pulling Emma's collar snug and smoothing Noah's tousled hair. She pressed a kiss to each forehead, her voice cracking softly as she whispered, "Be brave, my loves." Emma nodded fiercely. Noah clung to his sister's hand, his gaze following Olivia with the stubborn devotion only a small boy could muster. Only after the children disappeared behind the gate did Olivia allow herself a deep breath. The wind sliced through her thin layers, making her shiver, but she refused to slow down. She turned and ran, blending into the city's ceaseless tide. Her worn shoes squeaked faintly with each step across uneven bricks. The pavement blurred beneath her, golden leaves scattered across the sidewalk. The streetlights blinked on one by one, casting a washed-out glow over the encroaching dusk. Inside her, old feelings rose like a tide. Fear of rejection, the helplessness of someone who had lost too much, and a fragile, stubborn hope that somewhere, someone might still see her worth. Sometimes, moving through the indifferent crowds, Olivia felt like a smudge of ink on a white page, small, formless, and heartbreakingly easy to overlook. A car splashed through a puddle nearby, sending a spray of dirty water arcing toward the curb. Olivia flinched, skidding on the slick stone. For a breathless second, the world tilted wildly. She almost fell, but at the last instant, she caught herself, palms scraping raw against the rough ground. Pain flared along her wrist, sharp and burning. Olivia clenched her jaw, then let out a soft, breathless laugh. A tiny laugh, but enough to hold back the tears that had pooled at the corners of her eyes. Because she knew, if she cried now, she might never get up again. She brushed the dust from her skirt, lifted her chin, and pressed on. Her steps were slower but steadier now. The old shoes, battered and thin, carried her forward, carrying her toward a fragile sliver of opportunity, a place that just maybe could offer her a beginning, however small. Olivia didn't dare to dream too grandly anymore. She had learned to live on the smallest hopes: a full meal for her children, a warm roof through the winter, a job steady enough to nurture the faint flicker of survival. But deep within her, buried beneath the daily battle, there still lived a piece of her soul that whispered of larger dreams, that one day she would no longer have to flee from fear and poverty, that one day her wounds might heal in the light of something kinder. Somewhere, across the fading sky, the bells of a church pealed softly, their song spilling into the gathering dusk. Olivia did not look back. She crossed a narrow street, turned into a quiet lane. Ahead, the charity organization's building came into view, modest yet dignified, its brass sign catching the faint gold of the street lamps. At the steps, Olivia paused. She smoothed her skirt, straightened her coat, drew in a deep breath. Then she climbed. Her worn shoes squeaked against the stone, an old, familiar sound, and if anyone had listened very closely in that moment, they might have heard it too. The soft, fierce rhythm of a small, stubborn heart refusing to let the last scraps of hope slip away. The heavy door of the charity building creaked open with a soft groan. Olivia Carter drew a deep breath, clutched the worn fabric of her old tote bag. Inside it, a battered CV folded neatly, and stepped in, her scuffed heels tapping lightly against the polished stone floor. The main hall was awash with natural light. Large paintings lined the corridor walls, depicting scenes of charity work from around the world, but Olivia barely glanced at them. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat sharp and unrelenting. She approached the reception desk, her voice gentle but tinged with a tremor. "Good afternoon. I'm Olivia Carter. I have an interview scheduled for the project assistant position." The young receptionist offered a polite smile and gestured toward a row of chairs. "Please have a seat. The director will call you shortly." Olivia nodded her thanks and found an empty spot. Sitting down, she hugged the tote bag to her lap like a fragile shield. Her eyes flickered over the others waiting nearby. Sharp suits, gleaming shoes, sleek hairstyles meticulously arranged. And her? Worn shoes, a simple dress washed thin with age, a crumpled CV carrying the last remnants of a life once filled with promise. She tightened her grip on the bag. Each time she faced those silent judgments, even imagined, she felt her painful past peel open anew. But she was used to it. She had learned to smile even when all that remained inside her was scar tissue. A glass door nearby swung open with a soft click. Another assistant stepped into the hall, scanning the room before calling, "Olivia Carter?" Olivia rose, nodded, and followed, her heartbeat stumbling with every step. The interview room was at the far end of a long, hushed corridor. A closed wooden door awaited them, a small brass plaque gleaming, "Executive Director." The assistant tapped twice, then pushed the door open. Alexander Drake sat behind a vast desk, framed by the pale winter light streaming in from the window behind him. The tailored dark suit, the crisp white cuffs at his wrists, the measured stillness of his body, all spoke of authority wrapped in a cold, distant veneer. Olivia stepped inside and stopped a respectful distance from the desk. She dipped her head in greeting, offering a small, composed smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Drake. I'm Olivia Carter." Alexander looked up at her, his gaze sharp and assessing, cutting down her small frame in a swift sweep. He noted the washed-out dress, the frayed shoes, the hurriedly tied hair, the knuckles white where she gripped the bag. Ordinary, unremarkable. Except for her eyes that held a quiet, unyielding strength. Alexander leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Have a seat," he said coolly. Olivia sat, spine straight, hands clenching the fabric of her bag. She set it carefully on her lap, as if it were the last steady thing in the world. Alexander tapped his tablet and scanned through her file. Elementary. School teacher. Previously employed at a public school. He read aloud, his voice neutral. Olivia nodded. "And you left 3 years ago," Alexander added, one eyebrow lifting. "Why?" Olivia stiffened slightly. Old memories surged up. Her ex-husband's accusing glare, the sterile courtroom, the echo of words that had tried to strip her bare. She swallowed hard. "Family reasons," she replied, keeping her voice even. Alexander's gaze sharpened. "Family?" His tone blurred the line between question and accusation. For a heartbeat, it felt like her old wounds were being ripped open under that scrutiny. She drew a breath, steadying herself. "Yes, I needed to care for my 2 children and rebuild our lives." Silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. Alexander reclined slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing, voice colder. "And now you're applying here. Is it out of genuine passion or just desperation?" The words landed like a blow. For a moment, Olivia froze, the past crashing into her with sickening force. "You just want someone to save you. No one wants to carry a broken thing." She gripped the tote so tightly her fingers whitened, but she did not cry. Not now, not here. Olivia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, not with defiance but with quiet, immovable resolve. "I'm here," she said steadily, "because I believe I can still do something good, and I am not asking for anyone's pity." Alexander said nothing. Something, barely perceptible, cracked in the icy armor around him. Something almost like respect, though not yet fully born. The interview continued with stiff professionalism. Alexander asked about her experiences. Olivia answered clearly, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. When it ended, she rose, bowed her head. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Drake." He gave only a curt nod. The door clicked shut behind her. Olivia walked back down the hall, head held high, tote pressed firmly to her side. Inside, the battered CV remained, a silent witness to a dignity she had fought to protect to the very last. She knew her chances were slim, but she also knew this. Today, she had not let her past decide her worth, and for that, however small, she had earned the right to be proud. The late afternoon wind stirred the bare branches in the small park at the corner of the street. Winter had arrived. The sun sulked behind thick gray clouds, leaving only feeble streaks of light across a ground littered with brittle yellow leaves. Olivia Carter walked slowly along the gravel path, clutching the old canvas bag that held her wrinkled resume, a fragile vessel of all her doubts and dwindling hopes. Her hair, dulled and faded from too many months of sun and too little care, whipped about in the chill. Her thin coat barely kept out the cold, but Olivia hardly noticed. The emptiness swelling inside her was colder than the wind could ever be. She chose a stone bench tucked beneath a rustling tree and sat down, letting her body sag into the stillness. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. All that was left now was exhaustion, so deep that even sadness felt distant, blurred. The interview replayed in her mind, a sharp, clean wound. Alexander Drake's cool gaze, the ruthless questions that had laid her bare beneath the sterile light of that bright room. All the years of striving, of clawing her way forward, seemed to dissolve in that instant, leaving her raw, unseen. Olivia opened her eyes and pulled out the crumpled resume. She laid it across her lap, smoothing the folds with trembling fingers. But the more she pressed, the deeper the creases seemed to etch themselves, stubborn marks of all the time that had slipped away. Her vision blurred. She wondered if there was anything left of her that still mattered. In a world filled with younger, faster, more polished contenders, was there room for a single mother with 2 small children and a heart patched together with invisible scars? A sudden gust of wind tugged at the paper, making it tremble in her hands. Olivia clutched it tightly as if letting go would mean surrendering to the storm entirely. She sat there, silent and still. Alone among the muted sounds of the city, she was a solitary figure carved out of quiet desperation. The old phone in her bag vibrated suddenly, startling her. Olivia fumbled it out with chilled fingers, heart pounding with the familiar cocktail of hope and dread. The screen lit up with a name. Emily L. Emily, a little girl Olivia had once taught, back when she still stood before a classroom with a heart full of passion and dreams. Olivia answered, her voice a ragged whisper. "Hello?" On the other end, a child's voice burst out, bright and hurried. "Miss Olivia, I miss you so much." Olivia pressed the phone tighter to her ear, her fingers digging into the cracked plastic casing, her throat tightening until she could barely breathe. "I miss you too, Emily," she whispered. The girl chattered on, recalling old lessons, afternoons spent hunched over worksheets, the secret snacks Olivia used to slip into coat pockets, the extra notebooks bought in silence for kids who had none. "I remember when you told us stories before going home," Emily said, her voice bubbling with laughter. "And how you always had candy hidden in your pocket." Olivia laughed then, a sound that broke and mended itself all at once, tangled with sudden tears she could no longer hold back. "You remember all that?" she managed, her voice cracking. "Of course," Emily chirped. "Those were the best days." Olivia bit her lip hard, feeling the salt of her tears on the wind. It wasn't sorrow this time. It was something softer, fiercer. The realization that even if the world had forgotten her, somewhere a small heart still carried her light. "I just wanted to say thank you," Emily whispered. "You're still the best teacher ever. Please don't be sad." The call ended with a chorus of giggles and a breathless goodbye. Olivia sat frozen, the old phone pressed against her chest, feeling the wild, unsteady hammering of her heart. The wind still blew. The sky was still gray, but something inside her had shifted. No, she was not invisible. No, she was not broken, beyond repair. She had made a difference once, a real difference, and if she had done it before, she could do it again. Even if she stumbled, even if she fell, she would rise. Olivia smiled through her tears and carefully folded the resume, tucking it back into her bag. Not as an act of resignation, but as a gesture of preservation, of everything she had fought for, everything she had given, everything she still was. The sun, timid and pale, slipped from behind the clouds, casting a fragile beam of light across the park. Olivia stood, the old phone still clenched in her hand. Her worn shoes squeaked faintly against the stone path. But this time, her steps did not drag with the weight of despair. She walked on, carrying with her the soft laughter, the tender memories, and a quiet, stubborn belief that the road ahead, however rough, was still worth traveling. Night fell over the city like a thick velvet curtain. The faint glow of yellow lights flickered behind high windows, trembling with each gust of the winter wind. High above, in the vast office on the top floor, Alexander Drake sat alone at his desk, a glass of red wine catching the low, muted light. The tablet lay before him, screen still lit, displaying a forgotten file he'd left untouched since the afternoon. Olivia Carter, the name lingering there, a fragile scrap adrift across the vast, empty sea of his life. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful, remote. He didn't understand why, among dozens of impeccable resumes, her eyes, those quietly unbreakable eyes, kept haunting him. He reopened the battered CV. The faded lines seemed to whisper stories of endurance, of invisible fractures only those who had carried entire worlds on their shoulders could recognize. No impressive accolades, no prestigious experience, and yet every word spoke of a kind of strength that Alexander, through all his years of solitary success, could not ignore. He thought of the way Olivia had lifted her head and met his gaze, not with defiance, not with submission, but with a quiet steadiness, as if to say, "I may fall, but I will never betray who I am." Alexander sighed, half amused by his own absurdity. He, who had built an empire with cold precision, now hesitated because of a single glance. He tapped the Approve button and sent a short message to the HR department. Candidate confirmed. Olivia Carter. Position: Project Assistant. The wine in. His glass caught the light, rippling softly. A glimmer, faint but undeniable, just enough to stir the frozen chambers of his heart. The next morning, Olivia woke to the tender brush of winter sunlight creeping through the cracks of her small window, casting soft strokes across the faded walls. She sat up, hair a tangled mess from a restless night. Across the room, her two children slept soundly on a worn mattress, their tiny breaths slow and sure. Quietly, she stepped into the living room and fumbled for her cracked phone. A new email notification blinked on the screen. She tapped it open and froze. "Congratulations, Ms. Olivia Carter. We are honored to welcome you to the Hope Foundation team." Olivia read the words again and again, afraid they might vanish if she blinked too hard. Her hands trembled, the world tilting slightly under her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, soft and unstoppable, not from sorrow, but from something deeper, the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being given a second chance when she had almost forgotten what hope felt like. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering wildly, like a child who had finally found its way home. A small sob escaped her, a sound raw and full of life. Because after all the closed doors, after all the nights she had lain awake wondering if she would ever rise again, here, now, a sliver of light had broken through, small, fragile, but enough to make her believe in beginnings once more. Olivia clutched the old phone to her heart and whispered to herself, as if making a solemn vow, "Sometimes, just one chance is enough to save an entire life." She moved to the window, where the first true rays of winter sun threaded through the gray sky, painting the world in soft gold. The road ahead would still be long, still be hard. Her old shoes would grow thinner, her days heavier. But it didn't matter, because now she knew. Even the faintest light could be enough to guide a soul through the dark. Somewhere in this world, there would always be small, stubborn miracles for those who refused to give up. If you have ever walked through the darkness, longing for even the smallest touch of light, perhaps you already understand. A kind word, a door left ajar, a single ray of hope. Sometimes that's all it takes to change an entire life. And you, are you still waiting for your light? Morning sunlight stretched across the polished tile floor of the Hope Foundation office. Olivia Carter, dressed in the plainest work clothes she owned, a worn white blouse and faded gray slacks, walked down the wide hallway, clutching a bundle of papers tight against her chest. She drew a deep breath, willing her heart to steady its frantic beat. Today was her first official day. The office hummed with the sounds of typing, muted conversations, the steady churn of a distant printer. Olivia dipped her head in greeting to the colleagues she passed, receiving only brief nods or the fleeting brush of indifferent eyes, cold as the winter wind outside. Her direct manager, a silver-haired man with a meticulously neat appearance, pushed a towering stack of documents toward her. "Ms. Carter," he said, his tone clipped and impersonal, "please photocopy all of these, sort them according to the list I emailed, and distribute them to the corresponding departments." Olivia nodded. "Yes, sir. I'll get right on it." She gathered the heavy pile into her arms, staggering slightly. Under the weight, a new day had begun, with photocopying, sorting papers, and data entry. No team meetings, no projects to brainstorm, no invitations to share ideas. Only small, nameless tasks that left her feeling invisible within the rushing current of the office. Olivia spent the entire morning hunched over the old photocopier tucked. In the corner, the steady drone of the machine mixing with the rhythmic slap of paper and the sharp clack of high heels passing briskly behind her. Sweat beaded at her hairline despite the chill of the office air, but she didn't complain. She reminded herself, this was a beginning. Everyone had to start somewhere. All it took was effort, patience, faith. And yet, during a brief lunch break as she passed by the large conference room, Olivia caught sight of a group of colleagues, clustered around a whiteboard, talking excitedly over a new project design, the very initiative she had quietly researched, hoping one day to contribute to. Another name was called, another opportunity handed to someone else. Olivia stood still in the hallway, the bundle of papers tightening under her fingers. Her chest ached, a hollow, familiar bruise. No one turned to look for her. No one asked her opinion. No one seemed to remember she was even there. She lowered her gaze and walked away, the weight in her heart heavier than the files she carried. Back at her small desk, tucked away in the coldest corner where even sunlight didn't reach, a fresh stack of documents awaited her as if placed by unseen hands. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for them, just as her fragile belief in herself wavered. She bent over her work, folding herself smaller and smaller, stitching each piece of paper into the silent proof of her existence. Outside the window, the light faded slowly. Another afternoon slipped by, quiet and unseen. Olivia bowed her head, lower, hiding the sting in her eyes from the world. She thought of Emma, the little girl who had called her days ago, and the stories they had shared, the genuine laughter, the small, shining moments. Maybe the world didn't always see your worth, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Olivia tightened her grip on the papers, holding on to her slender, stubborn faith. Sometimes even the smallest things could bear the full weight of a discarded hope. And she scars and all, battered dreams, and all would keep going, even if it meant moving in the smallest steps, even if no one noticed, even if she was nothing more than a seed buried deep in the earth, unseen but quietly, stubbornly growing. One day, Olivia promised herself, she would prove her worth, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet strength of perseverance, the gentleness that refused to die. In that cold, colorless room, she lifted her head and drew a long, steady breath. In her eyes, a faint light flickered, not bright, not sure, but unyielding. Tomorrow, she would come back. The day after, she would try again, and one day, all these tiny, overlooked efforts would weave themselves into something beautiful, something entirely her own. Olivia lowered her head, slowly gathering the scattered files from her desk. The last light of day slanted through the tall windows, draping her in a wash of pale gold laced with the faint gray of dust and time. The stack of papers wavered in her arms with each careful step. Pages filled with trivial tasks, small, nameless jobs, felt heavier today, as if each sheet pressed down harder on the invisible burdens she carried inside. The office had quieted to a low murmur, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the diminishing echo of hurried footsteps as the workday ebbed to its close. From the far corner of the meeting room, where the door hung ajar, a ripple of quiet laughter drifted out. At first, it was just a whisper. Then came the hissing undertow of voices, sharp, sly, and unmistakable. Olivia paused. She lifted her head, frowning faintly toward the sound. Her? A woman's voice giggled. Just a washed-up single mom, hanging on for whatever scraps she can get. Yeah, one glance at that resume and you know, nothing special. Another voice chimed in, cool and cutting. Probably just good at playing the pity card. Well, someone's got to do the grunt work around here, right? Came a third, shrill with amusement. The words, tossed carelessly across the room, sliced through the stillness like knives. Olivia stood frozen. Her throat tightened, her arms trembling under the weight of the files she held. The old wounds, ones she thought she'd learned to patch and protect, ripped open again, raw and exposed under the careless cruelty of strangers. None of them saw her standing there. Or worse, they did and simply didn't care. Down the hallway, just beyond the weak reach of the overhead lights, another figure had paused. Alexander Drake. He had been on his way to the meeting room, tablet in hand, intending to check on the progress of a new project. But the laughter, the jeering voices, stopped him in his tracks. He stood motionless in the patchy shadow, the harsh fluorescent glow falling short of where he lingered. He heard every word, every last, damning syllable. His hand tightened around the tablet until his knuckles blanched. Alexander didn't step in. He didn't call them out. He stayed silent, his face an unreadable mask, though something deep in his chest twisted painfully. He knew the nature of such scorn, knew how prejudice, once sown, could root deeper than truth. In their eyes, Olivia was nothing but a shadow, a figure easy to dismiss, easy to wound. Alexander knew that if he intervened now, it would only brand her further. Pity was a weight she shouldn't have to bear, and yet the weight pressing down on his chest didn't ease. He turned away, his footsteps muted against the cold tile floor. Meanwhile, Olivia remained where she stood, absorbing each blow wordlessly. Only after a long, aching moment did she lower her head again, clutching the pile of files tighter to her chest. Her small shoulders shook, not from the cold, but from the storm raging beneath her careful composure. She didn't cry. She had grown too accustomed to swallowing tears, like raindrops lost in a barren desert. Slowly, deliberately, Olivia turned and walked toward the elevator. Each step felt heavier than the last, but her stride remained steady. She didn't need to prove anything to those who refused to see her. She only needed to remember why she had come, for her 2 children waiting at home, for the fragile hope she refused to let the world extinguish. The elevator doors slid shut before her, sealing her away from the biting whispers. She leaned lightly against the cool wall, closing her eyes. Prejudice, she knew, once planted, often rooted itself deeper than any truth. But she also knew this. One day, she would rise, not fueled by anger, but by a resilience so steadfast it would outlast the venom of careless words. And when that day came, she would smile, not to gloat, but to honor the journey that had carried her far beyond the reach of those small, cruel doubts. The faint murmur of whispers behind her had faded, leaving only the steady hum of the photocopier and the dwindling footsteps of those heading home. Olivia clutched the stack of files tighter against her chest. The cruel words she had overheard earlier lingered like invisible blades, each one grazing her skin, but she refused to let them stop her. Not anymore. She made her way back to her small desk, tucked into the shadowed corner of the office, beyond the reach of the weak yellow lights. The nameless tasks awaited her once more: sorting documents, cross-checking meeting schedules, editing printed reports. Silent, invisible work that no one else noticed. Olivia sat down quietly, opening the next folder. Pages, worn and crinkled, slipped through her calloused fingers. A typo. A miscalculated figure. A mislabeled project. She paused, gently marking each mistake with a pencil. No one had asked her to. The tasks were handed to her the way one handed a machine a set of commands. Finish it, no questions asked. But Olivia couldn't turn away. Her instinct to do things right, to do things well, was rooted deep, planted during her years of teaching poor children to correct every tiny spelling error with care and patience. She worked methodically, leaving small, neat notes in the margins. Sometimes her pencil tips snapped from pressing too hard, like the slow erosion of her own quiet hopes. Olivia bent over, sharpening it with a small utility knife she always carried, her motions deliberate, almost reverent, as though she were stitching herself back together, one correction at a time. Time dragged its heavy feet across the evening. Outside, the sky had darkened unnoticed, and the first sharp gusts of winter wind moaned against the window panes, carrying the scent of rain. By 1, her colleagues left, the office emptying until only Olivia remained, a lone figure bathed in the soft halo of her desk lamp. She bit her lip, double-checking every sheet before stacking them carefully, ready for delivery to the planning department. No one would see. No one would praise her. No one would even know. But Olivia felt a quiet steadiness settle in her chest. She knew she had done her best. She knew she hadn't given up. A soft sound broke the silence. A rustle from the printing room nearby. Olivia looked up. Mr. Harris, the elderly employee with wispy gray hair, was fumbling to gather a mess of papers scattered across the floor. His glasses slipped down his nose, his back stooped from the slow, stubborn passage of years. Without hesitating, Olivia rose and hurried over. "Let me help you," she said gently. Mr. Harris blinked up at her in mild surprise, then smiled, his worn face softening. "Thank you, Ms. Carter." Together they gathered the papers, Olivia quickly sorting them into order, flipping through to check the figures. She noticed small mistakes. Numbers misaligned, formatting errors, minor oversights. Again, no one would have blamed her for ignoring them. But she couldn't. She picked up her pencil once more, quietly marking corrections. Then, handed the sheaf back to Mr. Harris. "You might want to double-check before submitting it," she said with a kind smile. "They're just small things, but they could cause confusion." Mr. Harris took the stack, studying her careful notes through the thick lenses of his glasses. His eyes, dulled with age, shimmered with sudden, unguarded gratitude. "Not everyone would notice," he whispered. "Thank you, Olivia." It was the first time in all her days here that someone had said those words aloud to her, with no artifice, no condescension, only the pure, simple weight of true thanks. Her heart trembled, fragile as a leaf catching the first drop of rain, after a long, desolate drought. Just 2 words. So small, but they illuminated a dark corner of her heart that had long been hidden from the sun. Olivia bowed her head slightly, hiding the trembling smile curling at her lips. As Mr. Harris shuffled away down the long hallway, Olivia stood watching him, the curve of his back slowly disappearing into the dimness. Outside, the rain had begun. Thin, tentative threads brushing against the windows like tender memories. She returned to her desk, folding the scrap of notes she'd made and tucking it neatly atop the finished files ready for tomorrow. Beside the stack, the newly sharpened pencil rested in her palm. Small, modest, but keen-edged, much like the resilience she carried inside her. No one saw, no one recorded. But every quiet act of kindness, every unnoticed piece of diligence, planted seeds that would bloom in silence. And Olivia knew, even if no spotlight ever found her, even if no applause ever warmed her, it was enough that someone, somewhere, had felt her presence and been lifted, even a little. Outside, the rain whispered against the glass, soothing and soft. Olivia closed her hand around the pencil, whispered into the hush, "Even if no one sees, I will keep going." The drizzle, stubborn and ceaseless since the afternoon, showed no sign of letting up. Tiny droplets clung to the car windows, smearing into long, weary streaks under the dim, yellow streetlights. Olivia sat in the back seat, clutching a folder of field notes against her chest. The warmth she had carried from Mr. Harris's earlier thanks still lingered somewhere inside her. A small, flickering matchstick against the vast grayness of the world outside. Yet the sky remained heavy, and distant rumbles of thunder deepened the tension inside the cramped car. Alexander Drake gripped the steering wheel in silence. In the passenger seat sat 2 children, recently found living rough near the survey site. It was rare enough that Alexander went into the field himself. Rarer still that he had asked Olivia to join. Perhaps, she thought, it was only because she had prepared the best documentation of anyone on the team that week. The road to the project site was rough and slick with mud. Night had fallen hard, leaving only the car's headlights to carve brief corridors of light through the thickening mist. Olivia glanced at Alexander now and then. He was silent, his face set in stern concentration. Rain glistened in his hair, the deep furrow between his brows etched sharper than usual. No one spoke. Only the steady whir of the wipers and the soft percussion of rain filled the silence, composing a muted, mournful symphony. Suddenly, the car jolted violently. Alexander immediately slowed, but the front tires sank deep into a waterlogged pit. A sharp screech echoed. The engine roared once, coughed, and then died. For a long moment, time froze. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the muddy earth. All around them, darkness pressed in, broken only by the faint silhouettes of skeletal trees swaying in the wind. Alexander twisted the key again. The car made a series of helpless clicking sounds, then fell silent. They were stranded, miles from the nearest settlement, without cell service, without gas, without shelter. Olivia sat motionless, the cold beginning to seep through her damp clothes. The two children huddled closer together in the back seat, shivering. Alexander checked his watch. It was past 7. Olivia rummaged through her small backpack and pulled out an old flashlight. She flicked it on. Its beam sputtered weakly, barely, more than a dying candle flame. She turned to Alexander, her voice calm and low. "We need to find shelter, at least for the children." He nodded without a word, though Olivia saw his knuckles whiten on the wheel. They quickly gathered the few essential items they could carry. Alexander lifted the younger child into his arms. Olivia took the older one's hand firmly in hers. The trembling flashlight beam bobbed ahead of them, a frail guide through the relentless rain. The mud sucked at their feet, heavy and clinging. Olivia's battered shoes were soaked through, caked in grime. Her hair clung to her forehead. Rain, slicing cold against her skin. No one complained. No one wasted breath on despair. Only the sound of trudging footsteps and the endless drumming of rain filled the night. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. The minutes stretched long and thick, a slow struggle forward. Finally, a dark shape emerged from the gloom, a small wooden shack, its corrugated roof sagging under years of neglect. Likely an old workers' outpost, abandoned but still standing. Alexander pushed the door open cautiously. It creaked, but held. The place was battered, but it would shelter them. He beckoned Olivia and the children inside. They crouched on the damp wooden floor, their breaths misting in the freezing air. Olivia pulled tissues from her pack, gently wiping the rain from the children's faces, smoothing back their sodden hair, whispering quiet reassurances. Alexander sat a short distance away, watching her. She didn't complain. She didn't blame. She didn't fall apart. She simply did what needed to be done. Tender, tireless, unspoken. The flashlight, placed carefully on the floor, cast a dim, flickering light, throwing their shivering shadows against the walls. Olivia wrapped her arms around the two children, pulling them close, cradling them against her body for warmth. Her eyes met Alexander's for a fleeting moment. In that look, fleeting but undeniable, was something soft and fierce. A promise, silent but sure. We won't abandon each other. Outside, the storm howled, lashing the fragile walls of their refuge. Rain poured down in sheets. But inside the ramshackle shelter, something tender was beginning to kindle. A small, stubborn flame. Fragile, yes, but enough to believe that even in the darkest nights, no one had to be lost forever. The rain beat down like 1,000 tiny whips against the battered tin roof of the shack. Cold wind slid through every crack and splinter, carrying with it the sharp sting of dampness and chill. The old flashlight, placed hastily on the ground, cast a frail, flickering beam, barely enough to push back the thick blackness closing in around them. The four of them huddled close, their breath rising in thin, ghostly wisps in the freezing air. The two children, worn out and shivering, drifted into uneasy sleep in Olivia's arms. She wrapped her thin scarf around their necks, shielding them as best she could from the relentless drafts that sliced through the gaps in the walls. Across from them, Alexander Drake leaned back against the rotting wooden boards, his cold, sharp features softened by the dim light as he watched Olivia tend to the children with quiet, patient hands. Then, a noise outside. Olivia's head snapped up. The younger child startled awake, let out a strangled sob, and bolted toward the door before anyone could stop him. "No!" Olivia cried, leaping to her feet. She followed without thinking, without grabbing a coat, without the flashlight, propelled only by the frantic thundering of her heart and the primal instinct to protect. Outside, the storm raged. Within seconds, the boy's small figure disappeared into the sheets of rain and darkness. Olivia didn't call for Alexander. There was no time. There was only one thought anchoring her. Find him. Bring him back. Mud sucked at her soaked shoes, the ground turning to quicksand under each desperate step. "Where are you?" she screamed into the storm. "Answer me." No reply, only the howl of the wind and the deafening roar of rain battering the earth. A weak glimmer flickered ahead, the fallen flashlight. Olivia pushed toward it, her body slipping and sliding through the mud. Suddenly, her foot caught in a sinkhole. She fell hard, her hands scraping against the sharp grit of the soaked ground. Rain lashed her face. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin of cold and filth. Her knees screamed in pain. But she didn't stop. Shivering and gasping, she struggled, upright, crawling through the darkness. And then she saw him. Curled up in the sodden grass, the boy sobbed helplessly, his small body trembling. Olivia stumbled to him, dropped to her knees, and scooped him into her arms, pressing him close against her chest. "It's okay," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I'm here. You're safe." He clung to her, burying his face in her shoulder, his cries muffled and broken. They were both drenched to the bone, shivering violently, but Olivia cradled him tighter, willing her body's dwindling warmth into his. A flickering beam of light cut through the rain. Alexander. He reached them in seconds, his face pale and strained, his hair plastered to his forehead. Olivia looked up at him, her face streaked with mud and rain, her arms wrapped fiercely around the boy. Wordlessly, she offered the child to him. Alexander dropped to his knees, wrapped his thick coat around the boy's fragile body, and then, hesitating only a breath, he reached for Olivia, his hands firm but startlingly gentle. It was the first time he had touched her, not as a distant CEO, but as a man, another human being, reaching out in a moment of shared fear and silent understanding. Olivia staggered to her feet, leaning into the unexpected steadiness of his grip. She managed a trembling, exhausted smile, faint but real. Alexander said nothing. He simply tightened his hold on her hand and led them both back toward the dim, battered shelter. Inside, they dried the children as best they could with thin, musty blankets scavenged from a dusty corner. Alexander worked in grim silence, coaxing flame from damp, splintered wood. It took several tense, painstaking minutes, but at last a small fire sputtered to life, faint, stubborn, miraculous. They gathered around it, their clothes steaming slightly in the growing warmth. Olivia sat, close to the fire, drawing the children into her lap, her arms curling protectively around them. The flickering light illuminated the muddy stains on her sleeves, the scrapes on her hands, the bruises blooming quietly across her skin, and the unwavering, stubborn smile still lingering at the corners of her mouth. Across the fire, Alexander watched her, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as a burden, not as a project, not even as an obligation, but as someone fiercely, achingly strong. Someone who, when faced with darkness and despair, chose still, again and again, to love, to fight, to stay. A foreign ache bloomed in Alexander's chest, warm and painful at once. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside that crumbling shelter, another kind of light was growing, quiet, steadfast, and strong. A light born not from triumph, but from simple, enduring kindness. The kind of light that could save a life, maybe even more than one. Outside, the rain kept falling, relentless. The wind howled through every cracked seam of the battered wooden shack, carrying with it the cutting chill that slipped under clothes into bones, until even the air itself seemed to shatter at the slightest touch. In that darkness, only the frail, flickering light of the old flashlight remained, casting broken shadows against the sagging walls. The two children huddled in Olivia's arms, their breaths ragged and shallow, their small bodies trembling. She held them closer, gathering them under her soaked jacket, making herself a fragile shield against the cold that gnawed at them from all sides. Near the sputtering pile of damp firewood, Alexander Drake worked with frozen, clumsy hands, struggling to strike a flame. Fire, something so simple, so elemental, had become their last and only hope against the night. Once, twice, 3 times. Each flick of the lighter produced nothing but a sputter of sparks that died instantly against the damp air. Olivia watched him, a rising tide of dread swelling in her chest. Without fire, they would not last the night. Without fire, the children would slip into a cold, silent sleep they might not wake from. She shifted, reaching into the worn backpack she had stubbornly carried through the rain. From its depths, she pulled out a small box of matches, soaked around the edges but a few sticks still dry within their waxy wrapping. Without a word, she held them out to Alexander, her fingers trembling from cold and exhaustion. He took them, pausing for a moment, to look at her. In that moment his gaze softened, deepened, losing its usual sharp edge. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile and raw. Alexander struck a match. A small flare of blue flame leapt to life, wavering desperately in the gusting wind. He bent low over the kindling, shielding the flame with his body, protecting it as if it were a living thing. Olivia pulled the children closer, her breath misting in the cold air, whispering small, steady reassurances into their hair. The flame caught on the dry grass beneath the logs, a tiny glow, shivering and weak but stubborn, refusing to die. Slowly, it grew. The shack filled with a dim, trembling light, just enough to reveal their mud-smeared faces, the rain dripping from their hair, the bruises and scrapes lining their skin. Olivia dragged the children closer to the fire, spreading her arms wide to shield them, a frail arch against the cold. The light caught her face, etching deep shadows under her eyes, highlighting the weariness hollowing her cheeks, but also illuminating something else, a quiet, unbreakable gentleness. Alexander watched her, a small woman, ordinary, without wealth, without power, without even a dry coat to her name. And yet she radiated a warmth stronger than anything he had known through all his years of cold, gleaming offices and hollow victories. He wondered, with a hollow ache, How long it had been since he had witnessed such pure, uncalculated kindness, a reach of the hand expecting nothing in return, a shelter offered simply because it was unbearable to let someone suffer alone. He clenched his hands against his knees. The cold was still there. The rain still lashed at the shack. The night stretched endlessly outside, but inside him, something small had been lit, flickering like that frail fire, yet bright enough to pierce into the hidden corners of his heart. Olivia lifted her head, catching his gaze through the haze of rising smoke. She didn't speak. She simply smiled. A small, tired smile, but strangely, disarmingly warm. Alexander, wordless, tipped his head in a slight nod, answering her with a look deeper than anything words could carry. That night, they made no promises. There were no sweeping declarations, no grand, stirring speeches, only the crackling of fire, the slow, steady rhythm of breathing finding its way back to calm, and a trust so tentative it barely dared to take root. Yet it did, quietly, stubbornly, in the hush of the storm. In the darkest night, sometimes all it took was one small flame to light an entire life. The little fire still flickered in the center of the shack, its wavering light fighting against each icy gust that slipped through the warped boards. Outside, the rain continued to fall, though it softened now, less the rage of a storm and more the weary lament of a night slowly surrendering to dawn. Olivia sat close to the sleeping children, her arms wrapped protectively around them, their small breaths rising and falling against her chest. Alexander sat not far from her, his back resting against the rotting wall, his gaze fixed on the fire, but every so often his eyes strayed to her. In that fragile light he could see every plain, honest detail of her face. No makeup, no mask, only the raw, unvarnished truth. He could see the fine cracks, the places where life had worn her thin, and yet she remained. For a long time, there was only the sound of wind and rain, and the faint, steady breathing of the children. Then Olivia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, so soft it might have been mistaken for the sighing of the fire. "You know," she murmured, eyes still trained on the flame, "I used to believe that if you loved enough, if you were kind enough, you'd be loved in return." Alexander turned toward her fully, the sound of her voice pulling something taut and fragile inside him. Olivia tightened the worn scarf around the children, her gaze drifting somewhere far beyond the flickering light. "I used to have a little family," she said, "a house filled with crooked picture frames, dinners interrupted by laughter too loud to finish a meal. I thought if I worked hard enough, loved hard enough, it would all be enough." Her voice thinned, trembled. "But people aren't math problems. You can't just add up love and expect happiness to be the sum." Alexander noticed her hand, the way it clenched the fabric of the scarf, knuckles stark and sharp under the flame's faint glow. "My husband—" Olivia's words caught, and for a moment she simply breathed, swallowing the ache. "He left. No reasons that made sense. No chances to fix anything." From her pocket, she pulled out a small, battered object, a ring, dulled and scratched, its shine worn away by time and rain and grief. She turned it slowly in her hand, tracing the tiny dents with her fingertip, as if mapping the fault lines of a collapsed world. "The day he signed the divorce papers," she whispered, "I thought maybe there was nothing left in me worth believing in." Alexander remained silent, afraid that even breathing too loudly would shatter the rawness she laid before him. But then Olivia lifted her head, her eyes meeting his across the fire. Clear, sorrowful, but piercingly alive. I thought, if I stop believing in kindness, in love, in good things, then what was the point of everything I ever gave, of everything I ever hoped for? Alexander's fists curled at his sides, the quiet honesty of her words slicing through the thick armor. He had spent years constructing around himself. He knew that feeling. Knew what it was to be abandoned, to have faith ripped from you as casually as a discarded promise. Olivia smiled then. A soft, weary smile, but one so warm it seemed to reach across the fire and touch him. "So I chose to believe anyway," she said simply. "Even knowing it might break me again. Even knowing kindness can be taken for weakness, and love can be betrayed." She closed her fingers around the ring, pressing it into her palm like a talisman against despair. "I would rather be broken one more time," she whispered, "than live a whole life afraid to believe." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. Her words settled into him like a blade and a balm at once, cutting through the cold, dead places inside him. Once, long ago, he, too, had believed. Once he had thought love was a currency that, if spent selflessly enough, would surely return richer, and he, too, had been left empty-handed. Alexander opened his eyes and looked at Olivia. In that moment, he didn't see a poor woman. He didn't see an employee or a burden or a mistake. He saw a soul, battered but unbowed, luminous in its stubborn hope, sitting beside a fire in the wreckage of a storm, still daring to believe. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle whisper, the last droplets falling like a blessing. Olivia slipped the ring back into her pocket, then drew the children closer against her. Alexander reached out then, awkward, uncertain, and pulled an old blanket from the corner, laying it carefully over them all. His movements were clumsy, but his gaze was tender, unguarded. They said nothing more. In the hush that followed, only the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady breathing of the sleeping children filled the space between them. No grand confessions. No promises. Only the simple shared weight of old scars and the unspoken vow that somehow, some way, they would keep walking forward. In the long night, sometimes, a small flame was all it took to keep the darkness at bay. Night had deepened. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only the soft, irregular patter of rain dripping from broken leaves and sagging branches. Inside the crumbling shack, the fire still smoldered, sometimes flaring briefly, sometimes collapsing into a soft glow of dying embers. The light danced and faded, painting fleeting shadows on the battered wooden walls. Olivia sat against the wall, her arms wrapped protectively around the two sleeping children. The story she had shared, a soft, steady unraveling of wounds and hope, had faded into the hush, leaving behind a quiet so thick it seemed stitched into the very air. Across from her, Alexander sat in silence. He said nothing, offered no platitudes, no easy words of comfort. He simply stayed, his gaze pinned to the final glowing embers, as if staring into some distant place that no one else could reach. The silence between them was not heavy. It was tender, like a thin blanket drawn over raw, open wounds. A silence that understood without asking. A silence that didn't demand healing before the heart was ready. Alexander watched the last ember pulse weakly. In its fragile light, he remembered the years he had lived, a life filled with all the material. comforts anyone could ever dream of, yet utterly barren of real connection. Once he had loved. Once he had trusted. Once he had believed. But betrayal had shattered those fragile things with ruthless efficiency. Since then, he had learned to build walls high and thick around his heart, to forge himself into the man others respected and feared, but never truly knew. Outwardly, he had become cold, rational, impenetrable. But inside, he was still that lost boy, curled into the shadows of the past, too afraid to believe that anyone might reach for him with real, enduring care. And now, across the fire's last glow, there was Olivia. Silent, bruised, brave. A woman who had been broken, and yet still chose love, still chose trust, even knowing it might hurt her again. Alexander lifted his eyes and met hers. In that instant, no words passed between them, only a glance, raw, unguarded, carrying the weight of all the things they could not say. Her gaze met his without flinching, soft, worn, and full of knowing. She offered a small nod, barely more than a breath, as if saying, "I see you. I understand." Alexander dropped his eyes quickly, hiding the turmoil stirring inside him. His hand gripped the edge of his coat, a small, unconscious gesture, as if bracing himself against the emotions threatening to spill over after so many years of silence. The fire sputtered one last time, then faded into a thin, gray ash. The shack settled into a warm, embracing darkness, not the fearful kind that isolates, but the kind that draws people close, that shields without smothering. Alexander closed his eyes. He listened to the even breathing of the children curled against Olivia. He listened to the soft drip of rain. And he listened, for the first time in what felt like forever, to the steady beat of his own heart. Not pounding from stress or loneliness, but stirred by something deeper, something ancient and human. They didn't need words. They didn't need to fix each other. It was enough to sit together in the quiet, to know that neither of them was alone in their pain. Beside the faded fire, through the long hush of the night, the silence between Alexander and Olivia became something, fragile but enduring. A thread spun not from words, but from the unspoken understanding of two souls who had both survived heartbreak and somehow still chose to reach out. Some truths are too vast for language. Sometimes the deepest conversations are the ones spoken only through a glance. Morning light sifted in through the crooked slats of the shack, casting pale, broken patterns across the damp, cold floor. The storm had passed. In its wake lingered the raw scent of wet earth, of soaked leaves and rotting wood, heavy and real. Olivia woke first. She lifted her head carefully, making sure not to disturb the two children still curled against her side. Tenderly, she pulled the thin blanket higher around their small shoulders. Her gaze met Alexander's. He was already awake, sitting against the wall, his face turned toward the open doorway where mist still hung low over the desolate clearing. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a quiet, woven from mutual understanding, from exhaustion, from something still too new and fragile to name. Olivia rose, moving quietly across the room. Her bare feet pressed into the muddy earth. Just outside, the ground cold and sticky. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the damp, gritty scent of the world reborn after rain. It was a morning stripped bare of noise, bare of pretense, a rare, aching kind of peace. Alexander followed her outside. The space between them was barely a step, yet the silence stretched soft and whole, a silence that needed no filling. In his hands, Alexander carried a small bottle of water and a crumpled packet of instant coffee. He crouched beside the remnants of the fire, coaxing warmth from the last stubborn embers, heating water in a battered tin can. Olivia knelt beside him, saying nothing. Alexander's hands, rough with cold, fumbled slightly as he tore open the coffee packet and poured its thin, bitter powder into 2 stained plastic cups. Steam curled up in faint, tentative wisps. Without a word, he nudged one cup toward her, his movements hesitant, almost shy. Olivia accepted it, cradling the warmth against her freezing palms. The simple gesture, the offering of something so small and yet so needed, filled her with a gratitude too deep for words. They sat side by side, nursing their coffee, glancing at each other only in brief, uncertain flickers, like children too, shy to name the unfamiliar stirring in their hearts. After a long while, it was Alexander who broke the silence. His voice was low, hoarse, rough as gravel. "I read the project report you prepared," he said. Olivia froze, surprised. Alexander didn't look at her. His eyes followed the curling smoke rising from his cup. "It's detailed," he said simply. "We'll need to add more field data. Update the community profiles. But it's a solid foundation." Olivia blinked, absorbing his words. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a reprimand. It was acknowledgement. For a heartbeat, she forgot how to breathe. Alexander hesitated, as if searching for footing on new, unfamiliar ground. Then, in a voice quieter still, he said, "If you need help, just ask." Olivia's throat tightened. The offer, so simple, so ordinary, felt like a door cracking open after years of finding only walls. She almost refused instinctively. Reflexes built from years of doing everything alone flared up. But something deeper, something tired of carrying the weight alone, lifted her gaze to his. And in Alexander's eyes, she found no pity, no condescension, only a quiet, steady willingness to stand with her if she would let him. Olivia pressed her lips together, feeling the tremble in her chest, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A seed, tiny, tentative, was planted between them. Alexander smiled then, a faint, fleeting smile, but it softened his entire face, melting the hardness that had seemed impenetrable just hours ago. They sat there, surrounded by the steaming mist of morning, each holding a cup of makeshift coffee like a fragile peace offering between 2 battle-weary survivors. Sometimes, it didn't take grand gestures to breach the fortresses people built around themselves. Sometimes all it took was a small act of kindness, a simple acknowledgement. Sometimes all it took was someone saying, without pride or pity, "You don't have to do this alone." And sometimes that was enough to begin again. Morning sunlight burst through the leaves, scattering playful pools of gold across the muddy ground. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of rain-washed earth and the fresh, wild green of drenched grass. Olivia stood on the clearing, her small backpack slung over one shoulder, hair still damp, twisted into a neat knot. She tightened her grip on the strap, glancing toward Alexander, who was bent over the topographical map, quietly checking the routes ahead. The quiet moment they had shared over coffee that morning lingered in her chest, faint, unspoken, but real, like a seed just barely brushing the soil after a long drought. The rescue team had retrieved their stranded vehicle, and their group had returned to the unfinished work of surveying the site for the new project. Back at the Hope Foundation office, the following day, a new opportunity was announced. An urgent education initiative in a remote region had been approved. The catch: severe logistical challenges, minimal staffing, almost no allocated budget. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. After only the briefest hesitation, Olivia stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "I'll take it." Heads turned. Some looked at her with surprise, others with pity, a few with outright skepticism. But Olivia didn't waver. She understood what this was: a beginning, a chance to plant something small, something that might, with enough care, grow into something beautiful. From the back of the room, Alexander watched her. He said nothing. His hand rested on the edge of the table, his gaze steady, quietly approving. The first day Olivia set out to the site, she carried everything herself: boxes of supplies, a battered laptop, bundles of second-hand textbooks. No one volunteered to join her. No one offered to help. She found her own way into the isolated village tucked into the hills, knocking on doors with nothing but an open smile and a willingness to listen. There were days when the mud soaked through her shoes, cold and heavy. Nights when she wandered by lamplight, house to house, explaining her mission to weary families. But she didn't give up. She remembered the tiny fire in the shack on that stormy night. Remembered her own vow: better to be hurt again than to live without ever daring to hope. So she pressed forward, one conversation, one small victory, one trusting smile at a time. A week later, Alexander received an internal report. He stared at the attached photo for a long time. Olivia, hair tousled, shirt rumpled, arms full of handmade maps and teaching supplies, standing among a crowd of muddy-faced children who smiled at her as if she were the sun itself. Something stirred in him. Pride, fierce and full. Without telling anyone, without signing his name, Alexander quietly authorized a supplemental grant for the education project. He didn't make a speech. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply moved quietly behind the scenes, giving her the tools she needed to keep planting seeds of hope. The next morning, Olivia was handed a notice. Her project would receive additional funding: new books, learning materials, small stipends for families in need. She stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. No one explained. No one claimed credit. But somehow, deep inside, Olivia knew. Someone had seen her. Not with pity, not with condescension, but with real, steadfast belief. She lifted her head and smiled, a small, bright smile that seemed to chase the last shadows from the room. Sometimes, in the dullest, darkest days, all it took was a quiet act of faith to resurrect an entire forest of dreams. Each tiny seed of trust planted today had the power to bloom into something breathtaking. Outside, sunlight spilled like molten gold over the terraced hills in the distance. Inside, Olivia's chest, a seed cracked open, pushing out the first tender shoots of new life. Every seed of hope you plant today may one day bloom into something more beautiful than you ever dared to imagine. And if this story stirs something small inside your own heart, hold on to it, your own tiny seed. Because someday, on a bright and unexpected morning, you may find it has blossomed into something extraordinary. The early evening sunlight spilled across the rooftop like a tattered golden shroud, stretching long and thin over the concrete under Alexander's feet. He walked slowly, each step heavy, as if the weight inside him had finally begun to drag him down. No one noticed him leave the towering glass headquarters. No one saw the tall figure slip away from the glossy, bright world he had built around himself. Only the empty corridors and the soundless sweep of the elevator bore witness. 8. The rooftop. The wind met him. Cool, carrying the burnt scent of asphalt, of hot metal, and something deeper still, the faint ghostly breath of old memories. Alexander stood at the edge, his eyes tracing the endless web of streets below, the rivers of cars flowing sluggishly through the city's veins. Beyond the towers, the horizon burned in hues of bruised violet and dying gold. He thrust his hands into his coat pockets, and his fingers brushed something small and rigid, a crumpled card. He pulled it out, smoothing it gently, almost reverently. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting faded into soft smudges. "Always proud of you. Love, Mom." Alexander closed his eyes. For a long, aching moment, he let the past crash over him. Wave after relentless wave. He remembered his mother, the simplicity of her love, the way she had clung to belief in him when no one else did, even when he had given up on himself. She had loved him without condition, without calculation, and she had died alone. He had been elsewhere when the call came, from a hospital he hadn't visited in months. He had been sitting at a conference table signing million-dollar deals, congratulated by cold hands and colder smiles. He hadn't made it back in time, hadn't said goodbye, hadn't whispered, "I'm sorry." The memory blurred. His throat tightened. He stood there, the city fading to a distant hum below, the sky streaked with the last bleeding colors of day, and felt the sharp sting of tears he refused to wipe away. All these years he had moved like a machine, efficient, ruthless, untouchable. He had fortified himself behind walls of money, success, indifference. He had convinced himself he needed nothing, no one. But now, standing alone under the wide, wounded sky, Alexander faced the hardest truth of all. It wasn't the world he had been angry at. Not really. It was himself. Himself for abandoning those who had loved him. Himself for refusing to risk love again, punishing his heart as if it deserved exile. The battered card trembled in his hand. Alexander exhaled, the sound raw and heavy, carrying with it the wreckage of years he could never reclaim. He didn't cry. He didn't shatter. He simply stood there, stripped bare, letting the wind rip away the armor he had worn for so long. There, in the middle of the city he had conquered but never truly belonged to, Alexander was simply a man. A boy, still, finally, mourning what he had lost, finally admitting the hunger he had never dared name. And strangely, in that surrender, he felt something he hadn't in years. Relief. Because sometimes only by sinking into the deepest pain could one find the ground, solid enough to rise again. He pressed the card to his chest over the slow, heavy beat of his heart. It hurt. God, it hurt. But it also meant he was still alive. The sun dipped lower, and the city lights flickered on one by one, like scattered stars on Earth. Alexander stayed there a while longer, letting the memories pour through him, letting them hurt, letting them heal. Sometimes the one we blame the most is ourselves, the self we abandoned when we stopped believing. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't begin with the world. It begins with the silent, broken boy still hiding inside, waiting for us to come back. The morning light broke cleanly over the skyline, thin and golden, chasing away the last scraps of night's heavy clouds. Up on the empty rooftop, Alexander stood still, letting the early breeze tug at his hair, his coat, the silent weight he had carried for so long. The first slender beam of dawn cleaved the darkness. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Something inside him, something long dormant, shifted, quietly but irrevocably. He pressed the crumpled card to his chest one last time, then folded it carefully, tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat, placing it close to the heart that had been silent for far too long. Then he turned and descended the stairs. Not quickly, but steadily. That day, Alexander didn't bury himself in board meetings, didn't drown under spreadsheets and profit margins. Instead, he found himself standing in the dim, forgotten archive room deep in the building's basement, a place filled with abandoned fragments of the past. Dust motes spun lazily in the weak light. In the farthest corner, half buried beneath other forgotten things, he spotted an old wooden box. He knelt, brushing the dust from its lid. Inside were small, almost meaningless scraps, faded photographs, an old letter from his mother, and a knitted scarf. Simple, uneven, gray. The scarf Olivia had given him during their first field trip to the remote village. He remembered how she had smiled awkwardly, apologizing for the clumsy stitches, her cheeks pink with embarrassment. It wasn't perfect, but it had been made for him, with bare, reckless sincerity. Alexander lifted the scarf to his face. It smelled faintly of old wool, of rain, of sunlight, and a whisper of mint, the scent Olivia always carried with her. He clenched the scarf tighter, feeling the coarse stitches rasp against his skin. Not weakness. Warmth. Real and stubborn and alive. He sat back against the cold floor, letting the memories wash over him, asking himself a question that had no easy answer. When was the last time he had truly lived? Not simply survived between deals, not existed in sleek offices and silent hotel rooms, but lived, felt, connected, allowed himself to be moved by something that wasn't measured in profits or power. Alexander exhaled, a slow, misting breath. He had spent so many years fearing pain, fearing trust, fearing the tender, fragile ache of hope. But in all that carefulness, all that caution, had he ever truly been happy? Or had he only allowed his old wounds to fester deeper in the dark? Olivia, with her quiet bravery, with her scars she didn't bother hiding, had taught him something he had forgotten. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about loving anyway, about trusting anyway, even knowing you might bleed for it. He wrapped the scarf around his hand, the rough yarn grounding him in the present, in the simple, miraculous fact of being here, alive, capable of more. A decision unfolded inside. Him. Soft, but certain. He would no longer live chained to the past. He would live forward, not to avenge old hurts, not to fill an empty void, but because his heart, bruised and battered as it was, still wanted to live, still wanted to believe. Alexander rose to his feet, the scarf still twined around his fingers. He knew he couldn't change everything overnight, but maybe real change, the kind that mattered, always began in small, quiet moments like this. Living wasn't about outrunning pain, it was about daring to walk through it, with a heart still willing to feel. The sun had climbed higher now, gilding the world in soft, insistent gold. Alexander stepped out of the archive room into the brightness of a new day, lighter than he had felt in years. He didn't look back. For the first time in a long, long time, he knew. There was a road waiting. Ahead, not a road of isolation, but a road of fragile, beautiful, human connection. And he was ready to walk it. The sleek black car rolled quietly down the dusty red road, raising a low haze behind it. No sirens, no entourage, just Alexander, alone behind the wheel, the faint warmth of the morning sun on his face and the old gray scarf resting quietly. On the passenger seat beside him, a silent promise nestled in his chest. Live and connect, with a heart stripped bare of armor. He pulled to a stop at the entrance of a small project site. A cluster of freshly built prefab classrooms, the air thick with the scent of new paint and scorched earth. Barefoot children darted across the cracked ground, laughter peeling into the bright morning. Volunteers and parents worked shoulder to shoulder, hammering tarps into place, stacking plastic chairs, tying clusters of balloons to the rickety fences. No one recognized him. And that, Alexander thought, was exactly how he wanted it. He stepped out of the car, tugged the brim of a worn cap low over his forehead, and melted into the easy, bustling rhythm of the morning. No podiums, no speeches, just scattered balloons, lopsided tents, and sunlight bouncing off faces open and unguarded. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. Young mothers balancing toddlers on their hips, old men straightening crooked chairs, children whose bare feet kicked up little puffs of dust as they ran laughing toward a future just beginning to take shape. And then he saw her, Olivia. She stood at the far end of the field, her jeans cuffed at the ankles, a faded white shirt clinging to her frame. Her hair was pulled back into a simple knot, strands escaping to brush her sun-kissed cheeks. Dirt smudged her skin, but her eyes, those steady, luminous eyes, still shone with the same quiet fierceness he remembered. She was bent over a tangled mess of colorful balloons, her fingers patiently working at the knots. The sight of her, so ordinary, so utterly radiant, tightened something deep inside Alexander's chest. He didn't move toward her right away. He stayed where he was, hidden among the crowd, simply watching. Olivia looked up. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face. Then recognition. Their gazes locked across the dusty clearing. The noise of the world around them faded. No one else noticed the small electric stillness that bloomed between them. Only two people standing on opposite sides of a fragile, invisible thread. Alexander said nothing. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her, the kind of look that held no walls, no distance, only a raw, aching honesty he hadn't known he still possessed. And Olivia, sweet, strong Olivia, didn't speak either. She tilted her head slightly, a soft, knowing smile curving her lips, a smile that said, "I see you, and I welcome you, as you are, bruised, unsteady, and brave." Alexander swallowed hard, clutching the scarf in his hand to anchor himself against the wave rising in his chest. A gust of wind lifted the balloons. One, blue and bright, slipped, free, spiraling into the vast, open sky. Alexander followed it with his eyes, feeling something inside him lift too, something heavy, long carried, now gently released. He took a step forward. No title, no pretense, just a man and a woman, two souls who had stumbled through their own darkness, daring now to reach across the light. Olivia bent her head back to the tangled strings, her fingers working with patient, quiet determination. Alexander knelt beside her without a word. Together, they untangled the knots, slowly, carefully, learning how to unravel the snarls and tighten the bonds not with force, but with patience. Like learning how to trust again. Like learning how to love, not with grand promises, but with small, steady acts of presence. Because when a heart is brave enough to open, somewhere, on the other side, there is always someone waiting. Always. The afternoon breeze stirred gently across the small playground, carrying with it the high, clear peals of children's laughter. Alexander sat on a rough wooden bench by the fence, watching two orphans Olivia had rescued during the storm. One, a little girl with a wild ponytail bouncing under the weight of her worn-out backpack. The other, a quiet boy clinging to a scuffed soccer ball like it was the only anchor he had left in the world. Their laughter rippled across the dusty yard, light and unguarded, striking a place deep inside Alexander. A place he had thought long, buried under the cold machinery of ambition and loss. Olivia stood a short distance away, speaking with a few volunteers. She didn't look his way, but the way she stood, steady, open, radiating patience and quiet warmth, held Alexander's gaze with a quiet, magnetic pull. He tightened his hand around the old gray scarf tucked in his coat sleeve. And, in that still, golden moment, an idea took shape. Simple, silent, yet weighted with more meaning than any grand speech. Alexander pulled out his phone, navigating to a private banking app. Slowly, deliberately, he created a trust, a lifetime scholarship fund, for the two children Olivia had saved, covering school, college, and whatever dreams they dared to chase until they no longer needed saving. He didn't attach his name. There would be no credit taken, no grand announcement. Just a simple plain card, enclosed with the grant papers, bearing only a handful of words. You are never alone. No explanations. No declarations. Because the purest acts of love often needed no audience, no fanfare, only quiet persistence, like a steady hand held out in the dark. When he finished, Alexander sat motionless for a long moment, feeling something unfurl inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the brittle, conditional peace that came from accomplishments or acquisitions, but the kind born from giving without needing to be seen, from living not out of fear, but out of hope. Across the yard, Olivia turned and made her way toward him, carrying 2 bottles of water. There was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, subtle but real, that he was still there, not vanishing into the ether the moment his obligations were complete. She handed him a bottle. He took it, offering a small, wordless smile in return. Between them, something was growing, tentative, careful. Not sweeping or overwhelming, but quiet and real, like stones slowly stacked into a foundation strong enough to carry the weight of something lasting. Later, after the modest celebration wound down, Olivia found a small envelope left on the makeshift desk. No name, no decoration, just a plain white card. On it, handwritten in a simple, unadorned script. You are never alone. She froze, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Around her, the room hummed with the low buzz of volunteers packing up. No one watched. No one waited for thanks. No one gave any sign they knew. Outside the window, the setting sun dipped low, soaking the playground in honey-colored light. Olivia pressed the card to her chest, eyes glistening. Sometimes, what a soul needed most wasn't grand salvation. It was this, a whisper, a reassurance, a small stubborn light saying, "You are seen. You are not alone." She lifted her head, scanning the thinning crowd, and there, at the edge of the playground, she saw him. Alexander. He didn't wave. He didn't approach. He simply stood there, silent and steady, like a wall you could lean on without ever needing to ask. Olivia smiled, tears slipping freely down her cheeks. It didn't matter if he admitted it. It didn't matter if anyone else ever knew, because she understood. Some loves didn't need names to change everything. Some loves simply existed, unshakable, patient, and quietly, fiercely enough to heal the whole world. The morning sky stretched overhead in a soft, endless blue, clouds thin and translucent like spun silk. Olivia stepped outside the small temporary office, arms full of new class materials. Beside the door, the old wooden mailbox swung gently in the breeze. Inside, a single white envelope waited for her. Small, unassuming, patient. Olivia bent down and picked it up. She recognized the familiar handwriting of the administrative staff, but in the upper corner there was a tiny, delicate mark, a hand-drawn leaf, the quiet signature of the anonymous scholarship fund. Her hands trembled. Inside the envelope was a short, simple notice. The 2 orphaned children would receive full scholarships for every year, every school, all the way through college. No applications, no bureaucratic hurdles. It was already done, already waiting. Olivia gripped the edge of the envelope, feeling the hot prickle of tears rising behind her eyes. She glanced around. No one nearby. No expectant gazes. No hands held out for thanks. Only the golden sunlight spilling down the worn wooden steps, setting the small courtyard aglow. She pressed the envelope tightly to her chest. In her mind, the simple words from the card she had received yesterday whispered again, "You are never alone." And something brittle and dry inside her, cracked open and unfurled into a wild green field of new hope. It didn't matter who had sent it. It didn't matter why. All that mattered was this. Someone, somewhere, believed in her, in the children, in the uncertain, fragile future ahead. Tears slid freely down Olivia's cheeks. But they weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of release, because after so many long, hard years of fighting to prove her worth, she realized she didn't have to earn love. She didn't have to shout to be seen. She didn't have to beg for a place in someone's heart. Just by being. Imperfect, scarred, but sincere, she was already enough. Olivia turned, walking slowly toward the small playground. An old, unevenly knitted scarf, the one she had once clumsily made for the children, still hung over the wooden rail, fluttering in the breeze. She picked it up and draped it around her shoulders. It was rough, scratchy against her skin, but it was warm like an unspoken embrace. She tilted her head back, looking up at the soft blue sky. Children ran and laughed under the sun, their joy ringing out across the dusty courtyard like the truest hymn. And not far away, leaning casually against a tree, stood Alexander. He wasn't moving toward her. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, quiet, steady, his gaze on her, open and unguarded. When their eyes met, Olivia smiled. No words, no grand gestures, just a smile. A small, radiant affirmation that she understood. Real love didn't need proof. It didn't need permission. It only needed a heart willing to believe. Alexander dipped his head in a silent nod, the corner of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile, soft and tentative, like the first sunlight after a long winter. They stood there, not near, not far, bound by something invisible but fierce. Understanding. Sometimes the greatest miracle in life isn't being saved with grand gestures. It's being loved quietly, without ever needing to ask. If you've ever hoped, even in secret, that you are worthy of love, believe it. Somewhere, someone is already quietly choosing you, just as you are. You only have to dare to believe it and to smile back at yourself. The late afternoon sun spilled long, dappled streaks of light across the uneven yard. It should have been an ordinary day, nothing remarkable, but inside Olivia, everything felt quietly, irrevocably rearranged. She sat on the worn wooden steps. Outside the temporary office, the soft gray scarf draped loosely around her neck. The two orphaned children nestled against her, each with a small arm wrapped around her waist, their heads resting trustingly on her shoulders, as if they had found the safest place in the world. In Olivia's hand, the small card remained. A deep, simple whisper of comfort, breathing in time with her own heart. You are never alone. Olivia closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let her defenses fall away, and the tears came. Not the tears of anger or failure or loss, but tears of pure gratitude, clear, clean, like rain after a long drought. She tightened her arms around the children. They said nothing, only pressed closer into her sides, sensing in their small, instinctive way the invisible shift blooming inside her, the crumbling of walls, the softening of something once hardened beyond reach. Above them, the sky stretched vast and pale blue, untouched and infinite. Olivia thought of all the nights she had cried alone in the dark, when believing in the goodness of the world seemed like the most fragile, foolish thing. She remembered the stinging judgment, the silent dismissals, the slow erosion of hope by a society that measured women like her in cruel, narrow terms of perfection. She had once sworn she would never hope again. Never trust. Never dream of kindness she could not earn through sheer grit. Yet here she was, brought to her knees, undone not by cruelty, but by 4 simple words on a plain white card. You are never alone. No signature, no promises, no grand declarations, just presence. Quiet, sure, offered exactly when she needed it most, as steady and unyielding as a lifeline thrown to someone flailing in deep water. Olivia brushed her hand over the silky hair of the child at her side, the familiar texture grounding her, steadying the ache in her chest. And in that tender, broken open place inside herself, she realized faith had never abandoned her. It had only waited, patiently, for her to gather enough courage to open the door again, to believe that even in a world so often bruised and brutal, there were still hands sowing seeds of goodness in secret, to believe that no scar was too deep to be seen or soothed, to believe that she was allowed to go on living, not despite her failures, not despite her brokenness, but because of them. She was worthy of love simply because she existed. A soft breeze stirred, lifting the end of her scarf and brushing against the card in her hand, as if to nudge her gently forward. Everything, the card seemed to whisper, could begin again, if only she dared to believe. One more time. Olivia opened her eyes, lifting them to the horizon where the last of the sunlight faded into a dusky gold. A single shaft of light remained, slender and steadfast, reaching across, the field like a whispered promise. She lowered her gaze, pressing the card against her chest, and breathed out a shaky, trembling thanks. Thank you, whoever you are. And in that breath, in that tiny act of surrender, she knew. To trust again, to love again, was perhaps the greatest, most beautiful gift she could ever give herself. The sun sank slowly behind the low hills, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of orange and crimson before softening into a tender wash of gold. Olivia sat on the worn wooden steps, arms wrapped loosely around her knees, the old gray scarf draped carelessly over her shoulders. Her breathing was steady and slow, like the gentle ripples of a distant tide. The tears had long since dried. All that remained was a quiet peace, spreading through her chest like fresh roots after a storm. Soft but determined, silent but alive. Fellow volunteer approached, a stack of papers in her hand. "Olivia," she said with a kind smile, "we're trying to set up a little volunteer school for the children around here. We're desperately short on teachers. Would you be willing to help?" Olivia reached out and took the papers, flipping through the coarse black and white pages. Simple alphabets, basic numbers, childish drawings of hearts, houses, clumsy sketches of dreams too big to fit neatly on a page. Something in her heart fluttered, tightened. She remembered how it used to feel to stand in front of a classroom, the pure, shining faith in children's eyes when they looked up at her. Faith so untainted, so fiercely hopeful, it seemed nothing in the world could ever tarnish it. And she remembered how she had lost it, how it had been taken from her, piece by piece, when her world collapsed. Olivia lifted her head and gazed at the sky, now deepening into twilight. A soft breeze passed through, cool against her skin. She smiled. "Yes," she said quietly, but with a strength rooted deep, like a tree that has weathered 1,000 storms. "I'll do it." She knew it wouldn't be easy, knew there would be long days, doubts, moments of aching exhaustion. But this time, she wasn't moving forward out of desperation or emptiness. She was moving forward because she had something to give, something she had fought hard to reclaim. That night, after the children had fallen asleep in their patchwork tents, Olivia sat, alone under the rusted metal awning, the roof creaking gently in the night breeze. In her lap, a ball of soft yarn, the color of pale, rain-washed skies, she began to knit. The first stitches were clumsy, her hands trembling. But stitch by stitch, she found her rhythm, careful, patient, as if she were weaving not just yarn, but the fractured pieces of her own heart back together. This scarf wasn't for anyone else. It was for her. A small, quiet promise to herself that, even after all the falling, all the hurting, she could still choose to stand up, to trust, to love again. The young moon hung silver above, scattering light across the empty courtyard. In that gentle glow, Olivia smiled, shy but certain. Her hands moved faster, more surely now, each loop and knot a whispered vow. Each stitch is a promise to myself. I am strong enough to love again. She made no promises to never stumble. No promises to never be broken again. Only this: she would not let fear stop her from planting new seeds of hope in the world. And maybe, just maybe, that was the truest, bravest promise a healing heart could ever make. Beyond the low rooftops, the first scents of wildflowers floated on the wind. Somewhere, quietly but insistently, spring was already unfolding, in the fields, in the skies, and within the heart of a woman who had dared to believe once more. The first light of morning stretched long and golden across the dusty red courtyard, casting a patchwork of shifting shadows under the playful feet of the children crowding around Olivia. After a long night spent knitting each careful stitch beneath the humming eaves, something inside her had settled, a peace so unfamiliar it almost felt like sweetness blooming against her ribs. She tightened her hands gently around the two small figures clinging to her sides, a smile flickering across her lips like the first shaft of sunlight melting away the last tendrils of mist. Without a word, her steps, and the children's, gravitated toward the little kitchen at the far end of the courtyard, drawn, as if by the memory of warmth rising from a simple cup of tea. The kitchen was humble, its earthen floor cracked with age, its faded walls leaning under the weight of too many seasons. Yet, in the tender spill of morning light, it seemed to glow with a quiet gentleness. Olivia pushed open the creaking wooden door. Inside, a battered porcelain kettle released thin, ghostly tendrils of steam into the cool air, painting soft strokes of mist that curled and disappeared. The scent of herbal tea unfurled, fresh and clean, stitching invisible threads of calm through the room. She moved to prepare the tea, her movements unhurried, her fingers still clumsy with a kind of endearing earnestness. Beside her, the children's small hands clasped tightly together, their wide, watchful eyes following her every move. 3 chipped teacups sat neatly on the table, each one telling its own story of resilience. Olivia poured the pale gold liquid into the cups, and the rising steam braided them all together, 3 fragile souls woven silently into one another by a ribbon of warmth. The children lifted their cups with both hands, reverent, as if they were cradling something infinitely precious. Olivia watched them, her heart swelling with an ache so tender it nearly broke her open. She lifted her own cup, feeling the warmth bleed through the thin porcelain, soaking into the cold, hollow places that had lain dormant inside her for too long. No words were spoken, only the tiny sounds of careful sipping, the gentle hiss of the breeze outside, the silent falling of sunlight through the old wooden slats. A morning, so plain, so quiet it might have passed unnoticed, but to Olivia it was extraordinary. Because for the first time in years, she felt a peace not stitched together by denial or forced smiles, but a peace that seeped from the deepest part of her being. Peace, she realized, wasn't the absence of pain, it was the acceptance of it. It was the courage to open your heart, again anyway. Far across the yard, beneath the shadow of a low tree, Alexander stood, silent. His hands were tucked loosely into his coat pockets, but his gaze never left Olivia and the 2 children. In that moment, for Alexander, time seemed to still. No titles, no armor, no distance. Just a woman sitting quietly between 2 small children, lighting up the world around her with the simplest, most unbreakable hope. He tilted his head slightly, and a faint, almost boyish smile touched the corners of his usually austere mouth. Not dazzling, not ostentatious, just a smile, like the way morning sunlight slowly eases across parched ground. Olivia, sensing him, looked up. Their eyes met across the thinning mist. No wave, no words, only a meeting of gazes. A silent promise that no matter how many winters one must endure, spring would always return, sometimes in the smallest, softest moments. Olivia clinked her teacup gently against the children's. "Let's drink to the new day," she whispered, a prayer stitched into the air. The children giggled, their laughter filling the little kitchen, spilling out across the courtyard, tangling with the light. Olivia took a slow sip of her tea. It tasted clean and soft on her tongue, not too bitter, not too sweet. Just enough. Enough to remind her she was alive. Enough to believe she deserved to be happy. Beyond the door, sunlight spilled in generous ribbons across the wooden steps. And in the teacup, cradled in Olivia's hands, the light shimmered, too. A living promise that peace had been here all along. All she had to do was believe and keep walking toward it. The warmth from the teacup still lingered on Olivia's lips, still glowed against the tender skin of her palms. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, flooding through every window pane, illuminating the tiny motes of dust floating in the morning air like drifting seeds of light. Olivia rose, cradling the fragile new calm blossoming inside her. She walked toward the small wooden cabinet tucked against the wall, the place where she kept her most personal treasures, the little relics she hadn't yet had the heart to let go of along her long and jagged road. Kneeling down, she opened the bottom drawer and retrieved 3 knitted scarves, still fragrant with the soft scent of sun and cotton. 2 of them were small, knitted in a pale, hopeful green. The third, her own, was a delicate shade of seafoam, the color of resilience, of dreams tender but unbroken. Olivia ran her fingertips over the scarves, the uneven stitches speaking of long, lonely nights and a heart that had stitched itself back together, knot by knot, despite fear, despite everything. She turned, the 2 smaller scarves bundled in her arms. The children sat cross-legged on the floor now, still clutching their teacups in small hands, their eyes wide and shining with something pure and wordless. Olivia knelt before them, bringing herself to their eye level. "I have something for you," she whispered, her voice catching against a smile too full to hold back. Carefully, she wrapped the first green scarf around the little boy's neck. He stared, wide-eyed, before a shy, dazzling smile broke across his face, so bright it seemed to light up the whole room. Then she draped the second scarf around the little girl, who touched the rough yarn with reverent fingers, her face aglow as if Olivia had placed a crown of stars around her shoulders. Olivia sank down onto the floor, gathering both children into her arms. "This scarf," she said, voice soft and steady, "is my promise to you. No matter what happens, I'll always be here. Like this scarf, always wrapped around you, always keeping you warm." For a moment, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. The promises stitched into each trembling loop of yarn were stronger than any spoken vow. A breeze stirred the faded curtain at the window, spilling pools of golden light across the worn floorboards. Olivia closed her eyes, letting go of all the broken pieces she'd clutched for so long, letting the present, fragile, luminous, and full, settle into their place. Then she felt it, a tiny hand worming its way up her sleeve. She opened her eyes to see the little boy furtively sliding something into her palm, a crumpled scrap of paper, handed over with a shy, almost mischievous glance. Olivia unfolded it carefully. Scrawled across it in crooked letters were just a few clumsy words, but they struck deeper than anything she had ever read. "You are never alone, too." Olivia pressed the note to her chest. Tears welled up once more, not from sadness but from a happiness so pure it trembled at the edges of her being. Without thinking, she scooped both children into her arms, lifting them off the ground and spinning them in a clumsy, laughing whirl that sent their giggles ricocheting off the old kitchen walls, spilling out into the sunlight. Outside, beneath a sky ablaze with morning light, the scarves around their necks flared and fluttered in the breeze. 3 bright banners stitched from hope, from forgiveness, from the fierce unbreakable threads that bind mended hearts together forever. The late afternoon sun spread a wash of red over the dirt road winding away from the little cluster of houses. A soft breeze drifted past, carrying the raw scent of freshly cut grass and the warm, rich smell of rain-soaked earth. Inside the makeshift office, Alexander sat quietly at an old wooden desk. Before him, amid the usual piles of paperwork, lay something small and striking. A seafoam green knitted scarf, folded neatly as if it were a treasure. The scarf hadn't been meant for him. It was a gift Olivia had made for the children. But one day, passing by the storeroom where donations were sorted, Alexander had stumbled across it, forgotten, abandoned in a battered cardboard box. No one had noticed. No one knew. Only him, and in that moment, without hesitation, he had bent down, picked up the scarf, and carried it with him. It was simple, rustic, the stitches uneven, some too loose, some drawn too tight, as if the person who made it had poured every ounce of doubt, hope, and trembling, faith into each loop of yarn, learning to trust and love all over again. Alexander brushed his rough fingertips over its surface, moving slowly, reverently, as if afraid to shatter something impossibly delicate. And suddenly, a memory slipped through the cracks. When he was a boy, his mother had knit him a scarf almost exactly like this. Before she left, before the world turned cold and brutal and unforgiving. Since then, he had learned to face life alone, never asking for help, never allowing anyone too close. He had forgotten what it felt like to be remembered, to be cared for in the smallest, most fragile ways. Until today. Alexander lifted the scarf, pressing it lightly against his chest. He didn't know why. He just knew that the warmth from the rough stitches seeped deep into a place inside him that had been locked away for far too long. He whispered into the empty room, barely louder than a breath, as if speaking not just to himself, but to all the broken pieces of the world that had once failed him. Thank you for teaching me how to believe again. No one heard. Only the silent witness of the sunset beyond the window, painting the walls in molten gold. Alexander placed the scarf gently back on the desk beside the heavy stack of files. His hand lingered a moment longer, reluctant to lose, the fragile warmth still clinging to his skin. He leaned back into the chair, tilting his head up to stare at the cracked ceiling, his eyes distant and soft. There was no miracle, no grand reversal, no dramatic transformation. Only a collection of quiet, ordinary moments. A glance, a white card, a cup of tea, a handmade scarf, each one threading its way through him, stitching his scattered fragments back together with a tenderness he hadn't realized he still needed. A small, genuine smile tugged at his lips. Not forced. Not hollow. A real smile. From somewhere deep and quiet and true. He knew, somehow, that nothing would ever quite be the same again. He didn't need to bolt his heart shut anymore. He didn't need to wear his cold armor like a second skin. He didn't need to pretend he was invincible while bleeding out beneath the surface. He only needed to trust. To trust that somewhere out there, someone would always have their arms open for him. Not because he earned it, not because he fought for it, but simply because he was enough. To trust that every small gift, if he chose to receive it with an open heart, could become a miracle. The scarf lay on the desk, simple, rough, unadorned. Yet to Alexander, it was the final gift, the gift that hadn't just rescued a wayward soul, but had quietly, stubbornly reignited the belief that he, too, was worthy of love. Outside, the sunset blazed through the treetops, dazzling in its fierce, breathtaking beauty. A new season was coming. In the soil, in the air, and deep within the once frozen hearts learning to beat again. Some gifts, no matter how small, are enough to save a soul that has been lost for too long. The late autumn breeze whispered through the bare branches, scattering golden leaves in slow, spiraling dances before they settled softly onto the stone path that wound through the park. Above, the sky stretched a deep, endless blue, so clear it seemed to have swept away every shadow of sorrow, leaving behind only a tender kind of stillness, the last breath of warmth before winter's inevitable descent. Olivia walked the gravel path at an unhurried pace, a small, steady smile playing on her lips. Ahead of her, the two children she loved like her own skipped and tumbled, their laughter light and crystalline, weaving through the rustling leaves and lifting the very air around them into a kind of quiet, wondrous music. She wore a thick knitted coat, and wrapped around her neck was the new scarf she had made for herself. Soft, imperfect, but woven with her own hands, her own mending heart. The wind brushed past her, cool and playful, but it no longer chilled her. Her heart, once shattered, was slowly, steadily stitching itself back together with days just like this one. Quiet, unremarkable, yet infinitely precious. From a distance, seated on an old bench under a towering maple, Alexander watched her. He wore a deep brown trench coat, his hair mussed slightly by the breeze. In his hands, loosely cradled, was the seafoam green scarf, the one he had kept, hidden, like a small stubborn flame against the cold. Alexander didn't call out, he didn't wave. He simply sat there, letting his heart drift toward her across the leaf-strewn ground. He watched, as Olivia bent to pluck a golden leaf from the little girl's tangled hair, her laughter spilling out like sunlight. He saw the light in her eyes, a brightness he recognized, not because he had it, but because he had once lost it. And in that quiet, aching moment, Alexander understood. Peace isn't about forgetting the wounds. Peace is learning to smile with them, to hold them close and still choose to love the world again. A stronger gust of wind spun through the park, lifting leaves into a dazzling, swirling dance. The smallest boy, the one Olivia had once rescued from a stormy night, paused mid-play. His wide, innocent eyes met Alexander's. Without hesitation, the child lifted his hand and waved. A simple gesture, wordless, effortless. But to Alexander, it hit like a rush of warm light through the frozen chambers of his soul, melting walls he hadn't realized he still clung to. Olivia turned too, her gaze finding his. No summons, no demand, only a quiet welcome, tender and patient. Like sunlight seeping gently into the darkest corners, asking for nothing in return but the courage to stay open a little longer. Alexander's fingers tightened around the scarf. His throat constricted, not from sadness, but from a sweetness so fierce and pure it nearly brought him to his knees. He was being welcomed. He was being seen. He was being accepted, not because of what he had achieved, not despite what he had survived, but simply because he had dared to stand there, as he was. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, one step, then another, clumsy, tentative, as if learning, for the very first time, how to step out from behind all the fortresses he'd built. Leaves crunched softly beneath his shoes. The wind tousled his coat like an encouraging hand at his back, and there ahead of him, framed beneath the golden blaze of the maple, Olivia smiled, the gentlest, bravest smile he had ever seen. He was no longer a man carrying the weight of the world alone. He was no longer trapped in endless nights, listening to nothing but the echo of his own heartbeat. Because now, all he had to do was keep walking, and he knew, with a certainty as sure as breath, there would be small hands waiting to reach out and hold his own. The late autumn breeze brushed softly against flushed cheeks, threading through the golden leaves that still spun and fell around Alexander's steps as if painting a path just for him, a path no longer lonely. Just a few steps ahead, Olivia crouched down to tie the shoelaces of the little girl. The pale sunlight kissed her brown hair, turning it into a soft halo that made it impossible for Alexander to look away. He drew a slow, steadying breath, willing his racing heart to calm, then took another step forward, just one step. But for a man who had lived so long within the walls of solitude, it felt like an entire journey. Nearby, a street musician strummed a guitar, the raw, tender chords floating into the crisp air, weaving between the drifting leaves and folding into the hearts of those passing by. Alexander halted, listening. Melody wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, it was simple, like a whispered promise from a heart that had been silent too long. Olivia lifted her head, her gaze catching his. There was no surprise, no hesitation, only a quiet acceptance, as if she had always known that, somehow, someday, Alexander would find his way back to himself. The smallest child, the boy who had waved to him once before, broke into a grin and ran toward him, the newly knitted scarf fluttering like a tiny banner in the wind. He reached out a hand, inviting Alexander into his small, joyful orbit without a second thought. Alexander knelt down. He extended his hand, hesitant, unsure, but the boy clasped it immediately, with a trust so pure it caught Alexander's breath in his throat. Then the little girl came running too, clutching Alexander's other hand. Their small fingers, warm and determined, gripped his like anchors. Olivia stood a few steps away, watching, her gaze steady, warm as the earth beneath his feet. She said nothing, asked nothing. She only waited, offering her presence as a shelter, her patience as a bridge. Alexander bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. No one noticed, but a single tear slipped free, soaking quietly into the green scarf hidden in his hand. Not a tear of grief. Not of regret, but a tear of release. Of a long-held breath finally exhaled. The guitar's melody shifted to a soft, wordless autumn song, every note laden with memory, regret, and quiet, trembling hope. Olivia moved closer, slowly, so as not to shatter the fragile miracle unfolding, he between them. She knelt beside him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. Her touch was steady, warm. Alexander lifted his head and met her eyes. There was no need for words. Some things, the deepest things, are understood only by the heart. The wind still stirred, the leaves still fell, the music still lingered like the slow, sure beat of a heart waking from a long, frozen sleep. And there, beneath the golden rain of leaves, surrounded by laughter and music and hands that refused to let go, Alexander, a man who once believed he had forgotten how to live, felt at last the truth rising within him. He was alive. Alive to love. Alive to believe. Alive to finally reach out and hold the hands that had been waiting for him all along. And this time, he would not let go. The clear laughter of the two children floated on the wind, drawing shimmering circles around the three figures standing beneath the shower of golden leaves. Alexander tightened his hold on the small hands clasping his, as if afraid they might slip away, as if this sudden startling warmth could vanish at any moment like a fleeting dream. But the tiny hands only gripped tighter, stronger, more certain than any promise spoken aloud. Olivia smiled at him, her eyes clear and deep as a still autumn lake, shining with a welcome that needed no words. Alexander let himself breathe. For the first time in countless years, he felt his shoulders loosen, felt the crushing weight he had carried for so long finally begin to lift. They walked together along the path carpeted in fallen leaves, the soft crunch beneath their shoes creating a quiet symphony at their feet. The path wound gently toward a cluster of small houses, the temporary shelter where Olivia and the children lived, just a few minutes' walk away. Alexander said, "Nothing the whole way." But the silence between them was no longer a wall. It was like a soft, warm blanket wrapping them all together, weaving them into a quiet, unseen connection, a rhythm of hearts beginning, tentatively, to beat as one. When they reached the small gate, Olivia paused. The wooden gate, weathered and worn, swung slightly, on rusted hinges, creaking gently in the breeze. Alexander stood still, staring at it. In one fleeting moment, memories surged. All the doors he had slammed shut, all the bridges he had burned, all the walls he had built so high and so thick that even he had become a prisoner within them. But the gate before him now, battered, scarred, a little crooked, had never fully closed. It had always been open, just a crack, waiting for someone brave enough to step through. Like Olivia, like these children, like his own heart, trembling now, uncertain, but opening nonetheless. Olivia turned to him, her gaze steady and soft. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the rustling of the last autumn leaves, as if the invitation had always been there, waiting only for him to be ready to accept it. Alexander looked at her, at the children, their hopeful eyes shining too. The gate, old, imperfect, welcoming. He drew a deep breath and nodded, just a small nod. But for Alexander, it was a leap across an abyss, a silent vow that he was ready. Ready to live. Ready to trust. Ready to love again. All four of them stepped through the gate. Alexander turned his head once, glancing back, and in the golden light of the setting sun, he whispered quietly to himself, "The door was never truly closed. I just needed the courage to walk in." The little teapot whistled softly on the stove, releasing warm tendrils of steam laced with the gentle scent of herbs. In the humble kitchen, the yellowed light from an old bulb spilled over a chipped wooden table, wrapping the room in an oddly tender glow. Alexander lowered himself into a wooden chair by the window. Across from him, Olivia was busy pouring tea into small porcelain cups. Two children huddled at the corner of the table, bent over sheets of paper, their laughter bubbling, up like a secret melody, breathing life into the quiet space. Outside, the wind slipped through a crack in the door, setting the thin fabric of the curtains swaying like a heartbeat. Alexander watched it all. An old house, a modest kitchen, a cup of warm tea, two innocent children, a woman with smiling eyes. No grandeur, no applause or million-dollar contracts. Just the tiny, ordinary moments. So small, so easily overlooked if one wasn't paying attention. And yet, it was these very moments that carried a healing power the world beyond could never offer. Olivia set a teacup before him. Alexander received it with both hands. The warmth seeped into his palms, just like the quiet heat of the woolen scarf Sichiu had once wrapped around him. A silent, steadfast warmth that had found its way into the fractured corners of his soul. He took a small sip. The tea was delicate, neither sharp nor bland, leaving a soft, sweet trace at the back of his throat. Olivia pulled a chair beside him and sat down without a word, simply watching him. Alexander turned to her. For the first time, his eyes held no hesitation, no lingering fear of being hurt, only gratitude, and something deeper still. Outside the window, the sky softened into a pale shade of twilight. First stars flickered against the thin veil of dusk. Olivia bent her head. Unlooping the teal scarf from her coat collar, she folded it carefully, set it on the table, and nudged it toward him. Alexander stared at her, stunned. She only smiled, a tender, wintry smile, like the first breeze of December. "Keep it," she said softly, "to remind you that no matter what happens, you'll always have a place to come back to." Alexander tightened his fingers around the edge of the scarf. No one cried. No one needed to. Sometimes the deepest emotions didn't spill over into tears. They simply rooted themselves quietly, deep inside the heart. He stood up and stepped out onto the porch. The air had turned colder, but Alexander didn't feel it. He tilted his head back, gazing at the night sky where small, stubborn stars shone against the vastness. Far away, the city still roared with headlights and hurried lives. But here, in this fleeting moment, Alexander knew he had found where the true light began. Not from the dazzling lights of the city, but from within the heart, where love, faith, and kindness quietly took hold, growing brighter with each breath until it was enough to illuminate an entire life. He turned back. Olivia stood in the doorway, the children clutching at her legs, all of them looking toward him. Alexander smiled, a real smile, and then he stepped forward without hesitation. His footsteps folded into the wind, into the children's laughter, into the steady, peaceful rhythm of his own beating heart. He had found where the light began, and this time, he would never let it go. The place where the light begins isn't at the end of the road. It's right there, in the moment we dare to open our hearts. Millionaire CEO gave a second chance to a divorced woman, but she gave him a new reason to live. It's not just the journey of two wounded souls finding their way to each other. It is a gentle symphony of trust, healing, and kindness. Through every step taken under stormy skies, every quiet glance shared in the hush of night, every cup of warm tea, every simple woolen scarf, this story whispers to us that love, even when shattered, can take root again. That peace, sometimes, only needs a hand reaching out, a look that welcomes, to piece back together what was once broken. That happiness doesn't have to shout. It only needs to be present, enough to brighten someone's whole life. Because in the end, light doesn't wait at the far end of the road. It begins in the very moment we dare to open our hearts. Thank you to each of you who has quietly walked beside us from the very first steps of this story. Thank you for your patience, for your listening heart, for allowing yourself to open up and touch every small, profound moment. Your presence is the reason stories like this continue to be told, to be heard, and to be loved. If you believe, too, that no matter how fierce the storms of life may be, kindness and hope are always worth holding on to, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Because here, every quiet story, every silent character will be a tender reminder. You are never alone. Together, we will keep writing the most beautiful journeys of healing. See you again in the next stories, where love always finds its way home.